Hello everybody, welcome back. My name is 𝗥𝗲𝗃. I'm a developer advocate at Timescale, and in today's video I'll show you how to create time series graphs in Grafana like this and this. But before we get started, I'd like to tell you about us. We are Timescale, the people behind TimescaleDB, a time series database built on top of Postgres. So if you know Postgres, you pretty much already know TimescaleDB, which is super awesome because that allows you to do time series data analysis using SQL, a language you know and love. So today we'll talk about time series graphs in Grafana. A time series graph is essentially a line graph plotting points changing over time. It allows you to visualize trends and fluctuations within your dataset, and it's usually plotted within two dimensions, where the x-axis represents time and the y-axis represents the value of your data. Because the time series graph is the most common type of graph in Grafana, it's also the default one. Let's get started. If you want to follow along, there's a link in the description to the Timescale documentation where we explain how to create time series graphs using certain TimescaleDB features. But there's also a link to the video and documentation on how to get set up with our sample data set and how to get set up with TimescaleDB Cloud and get that connected to Grafana. So do that first, then come back and you can follow along without a hitch. So let's get started on creating our first time series graph. So you want to create a new panel, and then you want to click on this button to be able to create a manual query. And we'll build our first really simple query here. So we'll do select time and price from stocks real time, where symbol is equal to our variable symbol here. And we've created this symbol before. If you watch the setup video, you'll know how to do this. And then a bit of code that allows us to use the timestamp function here. And then lastly, we'll do order by time. Great. And then if we enter a symbol here, let's say Amazon, then we can see that we get the price fluctuation for Amazon in the last 6 hours. The problem with this query is that it is a raw query. So if we see here, we get all these data points and they're all the same, right? We essentially query for every single transaction in our database where the stock traded is Amazon. For the last 6 hours, that's pretty doable because that probably will be like a couple thousand results. But if we want to say the last 30 days, that's going to be so much data that Grafana will refuse to even do it. So what we can do is we can use TimescaleDB's time bucket function to sort of speed this up. The time bucket function will essentially aggregate all these metrics into buckets, and then we can use that to plot our price. So to use the time bucket function, we need to change the time from time to time underscore bucket, and then our bucket interval. The interval is the width of the buckets essentially. So we'll do bucket interval here, and we need our time, and we can say as time, and then we need to aggregate over our price. So aggregates are like sum, min, max, or in our case average, which is a good metric to use here. And then instead of doing order by time, we need to group by the same aggregate. So we'll do this, group by time bucket, and then essentially the same thing, bucket interval, time. And then if we put a semicolon here, we should see that we get a graph that's really similar to the previous one. Actually, we'll put this back to 6 hours. We can see that the graph is roughly the same, but it's much faster to load. Let's do 2 days here. And then we can see that it's almost instant. We can change the bucket size here by saying 30 minutes, and then we get a much rougher result. So here we have the stock of Apple in the last 30 days. As you can see, there's really big gaps here. And that's because over the weekend and during the night, the stock market closes. We don't want this. We don't want there to be a line here because there's no data, right? So we don't want it to bridge that gap here. Normally you'd go in here into the options panel all the way down to connect null values and select one of 3. Here it's set to never, but it still bridges the gap. That is because the time bucket function doesn't create a time bucket if there's no data in it. So a time bucket will never be null or none. What we can do to circumvent this is by using the time bucket gap fill function. And in this case, it will do that. So we can achieve that by changing the time bucket to time bucket gap fill. So gap fill, and then at the bottom here as well, time bucket gap fill. Cool. And then we can let this run, and you'll see that it'll not bridge the gaps. But this gives us a sort of a really ugly graph. Another thing we can do is we can add a threshold and say add a threshold for 48 hours. This will make sure that it only bridges the gaps between where it's night and day, but not the weekend. So we can do this. So as you can see, it bridges these gaps really nicely, but it doesn't bridge the gaps of the weekends. So it gives us a really nice insight into what the stock is without having to sort of look at these ugly gaps. Another thing I want to show you is how to create multiple graphs in a single panel. One way you could do this is by copying this and adding another query here, but there's a much better way to do this. We're going to go to our variables here and change our symbol from a text box to a query, and then add this query here. We go a little bit more in depth in our setup video, so if you want to learn more about that, you should probably follow the guide. Don't forget to select multi-value here, and we can already see a preview of the values here, so we'll press update, then we'll go back to our dashboard here, and this allows us to select multiple stocks at once. And then in our query, we need to add a symbol to the attributes we're querying for, so we'll do symbol, and then here, instead of where symbol is, we need to do where symbol in, and then like this. And then lastly, we also need to group by our symbol here. So symbol, and then we also should order by time. So let's do order by time, like that. And then as you can see, we have two graphs in the same panel, which I think looks great considering it's in a single query. I want to show you another really cool feature that Timescale has, which is the LTTB feature, which stands for largest triangle 3 buckets. And this creates these graphs. So the one in blue is the LTTB one. Instead of aggregating a whole bunch of metrics like the time bucket function, it downsamples your data, but it tries to retain visual similarity between the actual raw graph. And as you can see, it's a lot more fine and in-depth, which is very useful for some cases. I'll show you the query here real quick, but there will be a link in the description to our documentation as well. So as you can see, the red function here uses the time bucket gap fill function, but the blue one uses the experimental LTTB one, which takes in a time, a price, and then a resolution, which is taken from the range and then the interval. I think this is really cool. This is still an experimental feature, but I figured I'd show you guys because this is really awesome. We might make a video later explaining more in depth on how to use LTTB. So that's already the end of the video. If you liked the video, please leave a like. If you didn't, let us know why. If you want to see more, please subscribe, and I'll see you in another video.